3 years before I wrote Violator, a friend of mine called me up and asked if I could come to her because her car got sideswiped. This was somewhere in Makati. And she needed someone to be with her to go to the police station and file a report. So I went over. This was around like 11:30 at night. 11:30 at night. And the police station was very small. It was a very, very compact little police station. There were 3 policemen inside. They were just all very bored. And it was raining a little bit, I remember. And everything went well, but the police station stuck with me. And that was the germ for the script for Violator, when I sort of imagined what if you got stuck in that police station during a rainstorm and there was a prisoner in the cell who was possessed. I just mentioned that story to sort of illustrate that inspiration can come from practically anywhere, from a little incident like that was very innocuous. You can spin something out of it. So in the 4 films that I've done, or the 2 that I've done and the 2 that I'm doing, it mostly comes from fragments of personal experience. I never really start out with a theme or a statement, but that usually comes out organically. So inspiration can actually come from wherever you want it to come from, essentially. And sometimes you don't really have to go looking for it; it just sort of finds you. I think it's just a natural curiosity, just being observant about many things. Reading widely is very, very important, because I've always been a reader ever since I was a kid. So that helps. And reading as wide as you possibly can also sort of widens the aperture of what you perceive or what you experience, even if it's secondhand. I'm not sure if you really need to force yourself to be inspired by something. I think it just hits you and you can just take it anywhere. Like my police station story, that sort of stuck with me. And it never let go until I decided I needed to do something with it. I think for me personally, that's where the real inspiration comes from, when something sticks to you and you really can't get rid of it, or you have to find a way to release it and figure out how to release it. So yeah, fortunately I've never been in a classroom situation where I had to come up with something based on a certain set of guidelines. That's probably the only situation I can see myself consciously looking for something to inspire me. But most of the things that I make films from, or I write films about, are things that are already inside of me that sort of scream to get out. So it's just being open to all winds, I suppose, on an everyday basis, and always being curious about everything. Well, when I was starting out, I didn't know any better. And I was working, and I didn't know how to get into the film industry. There was still a film industry then. There was no independent scene that I knew of. Or there already was, but by the time I became interested in film, it sort of like got very quiet. There was the 1980s new wave, the Mole Fund new wave of indie filmmakers, experimental filmmakers, Raymond Red and John Red and Joey Agbeari, that whole batch of young filmmakers. By the time I was aware that I wanted to make films, that scene was already gone. in a way. So I didn't know how to get into the film industry, so I started reading script writing manuals and their books on how to make films, and they were helpful only for a certain length of time. Basically, I just immersed myself in manuals on how to make films or write scripts. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but it's a good way to start. But I think the most invaluable way to learn about film is to watch films. I've been a film buff as early as when I was 7, because my dad and my uncle were very big film buffs. So I was exposed to cinema at a very early age. American cinema mostly, but that was a good starting point. Eventually, I was exposed to Philippine cinema because of TV. Not necessarily the Philippine cinema that's revered by cinephiles, but the Philippine cinema that we're more familiar with, the comedies, the rom-coms and stuff like that. So at an very early age, I was exposed to that, and I became a huge fan of film in general. So I think that helped more than the books, more than I never attended workshops, but more than the books, more than the script writing manuals. I think watching films was more educational and more inspirational than anything. Coming up with the synopsis varies, at least in my experience. Sometimes the story comes fully formed and I just have to write it down. That's almost miraculous because it's also very rare. Sometimes there's just a germ of a story in there. It's just a couple of lines, and then you just have to work through it to come up with something that looks like a story that could be filmed. When I talk about like a fully formed synopsis, I'm referring to the police station that I saw and that I imagined had a possessed prisoner inside of it. In and of itself, that's the premise of the whole film, and just enlarging it into a feature was where the real work came in. So it doesn't really, there's really no set rules or no set guidelines. The story can stem from different aspects of the narrative: the character, the title, the setting, or a situation that you want to weave a story around. You really just have to hang on to the most compelling image or the most compelling aspect of the story that you want to tell and just follow it. It sounds so precious, it sounds so like mystical, but it's sort of what happens really. Just follow the germ that screams at you the loudest. When you come up with a story, when you come up with a premise, whatever it is that screams at you the loudest, whether it's the lead character, whether it's the secondary character, whether it's the place, whether it's the actual situation at the heart of the story, just follow it and let it flow until it reaches a shape that you can say, okay, this is a narrative. This is the film that I want to make. In the end, it's really just the story is the cliche the cliche goes that the story is king, and it really is. So the story should be paramount. In terms of writing it down to make it more accessible to potential producers, I think you have to recognize the hook in the story. What's it about? What makes it interesting? What makes it cinematic? What makes it something that you want to watch? There's no hard and fast rule on how to figure that out, because it really depends on what kind of story you're telling. And it really dictates what kind of film you'll be making. If, for example, you have a mystery story, but you're fixated on the character, then that means you're essentially making a character-driven film, and the mystery just becomes a backdrop to whatever you want to explore within that character. So it really depends on what kind of material you want to make, and then let that dictate how you write the synopsis. But it's very tricky. It's very tricky to write the right kind of synopsis so that others can be more privy to what you want to say. So it ultimately boils down to figuring out what the hook of the film is. When I write a script, I try to keep the director in me out of the room because he sort of gets in the way. So I sort of have to write the script as a writer. Once the director comes in, and he usually just comes in and knocks on the door or just forces his way in to see what I'm doing. You have to keep that out because when you're writing as a writer, you have to be free of whatever distractions the director in you might cause if he gets in on the creative process of writing the script. It's very difficult to separate the two, but it's essential to separate the two. Essentially, the writer writes the script, the director adapts the script. And in a more usual situations, there's a script writer and there's a director, and they're two different people. But when they're the same person, it's also the same kind of synergy and workflow. The scriptwriter in me writes the script, and then the director eventually adapts it. So there's two phases in the process. So I think that's the most basic correlation between the two. That's the most basic job description or division of labor between the two. There are advantages to being both the writer and the director. The most crucial one is that the writer-director has complete control of his filmography. From the beginning, from the get-go, he gets to have his say on what kind of film he's making because he's essentially writing it from scratch. The downside of it is that that's also a very exhausting process, especially if you're not a very prolific scriptwriter. There are many times in the last 5 or 6 years that I wish somebody would just hand me a script that I could direct or that I could connect to enough that to make me want to direct it. So it's an ideal situation on one hand. It's actually the most ideal situation. There's also an advantage, a creative advantage to having somebody else's script handed to you. Because there's a very different workflow, there's a very different set of challenges when you adapt somebody else's material. Setting is very important. In my case, setting usually comes first, more than anything else. I'm not sure if that's going to be absolute in all the films that I'm eventually going to make. But in the last 4 films, setting seems to have to come first before anything else. Like the police station in Violator, the room in If You Leave. So there's no hard and fast rule on how to develop an environment. Sometimes it comes to you fully formed, sometimes you have to work at it. But yeah, usually most of my films so far have been set in a single location. So there's not very much world building that you have to do within the context of those films. But there is a significant amount of trying to figure out the geography of the place, of the setting. That's very important, especially when it comes to actually shooting it, and you don't really have the exact location at your disposal. So knowing the geography of the setting, at least in my case, since it's all confined to just one environment, I think it's the most important in terms of developing the milieu. For me, it's the geography. I might have a different answer if I make a film that's more expansive. That's set in a more that's set in a more wider terrain or in multiple environments. But I think for now, at least at this point in my filmography, I think the thing that the overriding aspect when it comes to developing a setting for me has always been to figure out the geography of the place. As for characters, there's a lot of writers, when you read interviews with writers, they keep telling you that to let the characters speak to you instead of you speaking for them. It sounds like almost magical or almost insane, but it actually happens more often than you think. The characters actually do take you to where they're supposed to go. So for me personally, I, it's sometimes you can't help it as a writer to put yourself into your characters. And in my experience in the last 4 films that I've made, I've put myself in all the characters that I've created, which helps a lot because half of them is already developed because I'm familiar with a large aspect of them. When you're writing characters, you have to know them intimately as possible, and you have to let them let you inside them. Especially if you put yourself into the characters, especially if you put aspects of yourself into the characters, which also makes it easier to go in, but also makes it a little bit more difficult because you're now more immersed or more invested in the character. So you might even be more vulnerable as a writer when you write a character that's sort of based on an aspect of yourself. But it can be liberating at the same time because you can sort of like make that character a sort of a confessional. So yeah, in developing characters, you have to let them take you where they're supposed to go. I'm not sure if there's a science to it. I think once the character is fully formed in your head, that's when that happens. That's when that being shepherded into their world, into their minds, that whole process starts to happen once you've fully formed or become more intimate with the character. So I always say that tone is very important in films. Tone is actually, for me, the most important and the most difficult to achieve. We all hear the term all over the place when somebody critiques a film that's sort of a mess in terms of, and when they say it's all over the place, they usually refer to how the tone shifts radically from one polar extreme to the other. Usually that's a function of messy filmmaking, but sometimes it's intentional. There are a lot of like films where the tonal shifts are so radical, but also so they have a certain energy and a certain texture that makes it right in a sense. So tone is very, very important. It's also a very delicate thing to try and achieve. It happens on the page, it happens on set, and it happens in the editing room. You have 3 phases where you can sort of like get the tone right. What dictates the tone is usually combination of what the material is and who the director is. That's at least my theory. When it comes to me, it's since all my films are horror films, the mood is set from the beginning that it's going to be there's going to be a certain sense of dread in the films. And I don't write humor, as I'm not very confident writing humor. So there's also very conscious effort on my end to try to put a little levity in the films that I make, because they start off really being very heavy. But I don't write it on the page. I try to sort of balance it in terms of how the characters act, or how a certain scene is lit, or certain scenes that you put in between to give a little bit of breathing space for the audience and for the piece. Mood is dictated by both the script and whoever's making the film. I think one of the most common misconceptions made by a lot of people is that they confuse story with plot. These are two very different things when it comes to any narrative. A plot is what happens, and films don't necessarily need to have anything to happen for them to become good films. So, story is very different. Story can be what a character goes through. Story can be the setting. Story can be conceptual. I always maintain that all films are narrative films in a sense. And that may be pushing it a little, but I stick to that theory because I sort of see narratives in almost all the films that I watch, and I try to watch all kinds of films. So everything from very experimental work to overplotted blockbusters. For me, there's a narrative element in all of them. It really depends on your feeling for the material or your feeling for a subject that you want to pursue. Plot is very different. Plot is figuring out a chain of events that sort of culminates in something. That, for me personally, I never went to any screenwriting classes, but I think effective plotting can be gained from reading as much as you can. People seem to underestimate the power of watching films as a way of film education and reading books as a way of writing education, but I think reading and watching a lot of films and reading wide and watching wide as well can help you develop your skills as a plotter. But again, plot is not story and story is not plot. I think more than how to come up with an effective plot, I think you have to be more cognizant of the separation between the two, that they're very, very disparate and different things. And the sooner you get used to that idea, the more acclimated you are to that truth, I think the better your work will be in terms of script writing, in terms of coming up with what is essentially an effective cinematic story. Personally, writing a screenplay is the most difficult part of the process for me because it's very exhausting. A lot of scriptwriters will tell you to outline first before writing the script. I will agree with them because that's going to make life a lot easier for you. My problem is that I usually write straight to script. It's something I've been accustomed to from day one, and it's very difficult for me to change. The only change I made in my script writing process was to move from Microsoft Word to Final Draft because it made it easier to write in the proper format. You eventually get the hang of it, of course. You write a couple of screenplays and you sort of get the hang of it. I think for me, it's important to write straight to script, and it's important to also write without an outline because you sort of keep that element of surprise, not knowing where the story will go, not knowing where the film will go, and not knowing even how the film will eventually look in the end. What's its shape, what its structure is. That's for me, that's exciting. And it's also very daunting because especially if you're writing to a deadline and you're not sure if the story will finish by the time you need it to finish. But that's usually my process. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, but if you get the hang of it, it's difficult, but it's also very liberating to write straight to script. I usually start with at least I usually plot out the story in the usual three act structure. I usually write first in a 3-act structure. That's the most common, almost a default setting when it comes to screenplays. I'm not a big fan of it, but it's very, very useful when it comes to giving you a sense of order and a sense of what the universe of the film is. That's usually reserve that for the first draft. When you start redrafting, when you start the second draft, the 3-act structure now gives you a lot of room to move. You can get rid of one act, you can add more acts, you can do whatever you want once you have the structure down. So I think that's for any one of you who's used to the 3-act structure, who's been taught to write in the 3-act structure manner. Use that as a starting point. But try to move away from it if you feel it's not going to help your film become a better film. 3-act structure is just a tool in your toolbox. You can discard it if you feel that it's not useful, or you can use it if you feel it serves the story well. But as far as I'm concerned, I use it basically just to give me the lay of the land of the film. Once it's there, I usually dismantle it and put it back together in a different shape. But that sort of gives you a familiarity with the world so you can move around inside that world more freely. 3-act structure is Hollywood standard. It's American cinema standard. Not sure I remember the 3 acts, but there's usually a setup, conflict, resolution. I think that's basically it. Almost all Hollywood films follow the 3-act structure, and it's become a default setting practically around the world. And I'm not necessarily a fan of that outcome, not necessarily a fan of it being the end-all and be-all of screenplays. There are very few exceptions in American cinema when it comes to the 3-act structure. Like M. Night Shyamalan only makes for 1-act films or 2-act films. And there are other directors who make 5-act films. You Google a script and you download it, you'll notice that there's a very standard format for all screenplays. That applies everywhere around the world. And for those of you who are newcomers to a script format, you usually see a heading that says something like Scene 1, Interior, Living Room, Day. Those are the 4 fundamental features of a script heading. It makes you aware what scene is being described below. It makes you aware of where it is. Is it an interior shot or an exterior shot? Where exactly is the scene taking place and what time of day? Scripts basically just follow that format. You just write. It helps to have the scene number because at the end of the script you can just flip to the end and see how many scenes or sequences you need to shoot. Sometimes a script, when a screenwriter is writing it, it usually just flows a little more or less like prose. But when I write a script, since I'm already going to direct it, I tend to put transitions in. I tend to put breakdowns of certain sequences into shots. Makes it easier for me when we eventually go and shoot the script. But it doesn't necessarily have to be there if you write a script. So some writers prefer writing in Microsoft Word. Those who do that, those who prefer to write in Microsoft Word, it's very crucial for you to know exactly what the proper format of a screenplay is because you have to type it out all by yourself from scratch. But when you write with a script writing program, it's usually just a click of the button, say a scene heading, and you can just write it out, and it actually just formats it for you. So that's a little bit easier in terms of formatting. So I would recommend getting a script writing program just so you avoid having to do practically double work when you write in Word. But if you prefer the more liberating aspect of writing in a non-script writing program like Microsoft Word, then by all means go ahead. But please be aware of how a screenplay looks. That's very important for when you pitch it to producers and financiers and when you give it to actors as well. And it's also very important for your staff because when you're doing the pre-production, that's when you figure out how many sequences you need to shoot, how many locations you have to scout and look for. All that logistical stuff is helped immensely by writing the script in the right format. So essentially, you have to pitch your screenplay to two sets of people. Although the second set, you'll have to convey to them in finished form, which is your potential audience. But the first set, which are the people you pitch the material to, that's the principal audience of your screenplay. The screenplay itself, you have to write it according to how you feel it should be written. But when it comes to the pitch, that's a very different matter altogether. That's when you try to look for hooks in your material that are easily digestible to financiers or producers. There are a lot of producers who understand cinema inside and out, so it's a lot less difficult to pitch materials to them, particularly material that is slightly more difficult to sell than others. But there are also potential investors and financiers and producers who need to be given a little bit more of a hard sell when it comes to the material that you have. It really depends on what kind of material you have. If it's a difficult sort of material, then it takes a little bit more effort to find a hook in it. It's always it always helps to have a log line. Yeah, you need to have a log line that sort of encompasses or encapsulates your film in 2 sentences or 1. The less sentences you use to sort of describe your film, the better. The most common log line is like putting 2 existing films together, like Transformers meets Spotlight or something, which is it's a very reductive way of selling your film, but sometimes it works when you sort of boil it down to those 2 very, basic aspects. But usually it takes a couple of sentences to to sell a film using a log line. So keep your sentences to a minimum. But the log line is it's very important because it sort of gives your potential financiers a sense of what the film is about without really being elaborate about it. And then after that, you have the synopsis. You have to be able to sort of like weed out elements in the narrative and get to the core of the film. And that's your synopsis. Just get to the main heart of the film, the main hook, and use that as a synopsis. Everything else, all the other nuances, they're in the script. Keep it in the, and eventually they should be in the film. But when you're trying to pitch it or trying to sell it to producers or to financiers, you have to get down to the basic core of the film when it comes to the synopsis. So I think it's there's no process to it. There's no process to it necessarily. It's just, but it comes easier if you know the material very well. And it takes a little amount of crafting, especially the log line. You have to be able to be a little bit extra judicious when extra crafty when you come up with a log line, because you're trying to make even your most difficult script into something that can actually be sold. So that's always a challenge, but I think if you're very familiar with your screenplay, if you're very intimate with it, if you know it inside and out, it comes slightly easier than I make it seem. So.